All right, you guys, we are back. It is Jack Murphy. This is the Jack Murphy Live podcast. You can find me on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live, the website jackmurphylive.com, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Jack Murphy Live, all over the internet. I planned it that way. And then also come check out our all men's organization based on three core values of masculinity, brotherhood, and sovereignty. That is the Liminal Order at liminal-order.com. Today, I am so excited. I've got somebody on the show I've been trying to nail down for a couple of months. He is a fantastically interesting guy with very important work. His name is Joe Norman, and he is a PhD, and he studies complex systems and brain sciences. He's got a PhD. He's done a lot of great work. You can find him on Twitter at Normonics. Joe, thank you so much for joining me, man. How are you doing?
Jack, thanks for having me. I'm doing pretty good, and sorry you had to chase me for a couple of months there. Been a wild couple of months, obviously generally, but also specifically in my case. So
yeah. You've got young kids, and you had a fire on your property, and then there's the pandemic going on, and so you're in high demand, and you got a lot of stuff going on. So thanks for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it. As I like to do, I want to learn a little bit about you, Joe. We've been exchanging on Twitter for a while, and frankly, I don't even remember how we got connected, but there you were, and there I was, and we've been on similar themes lately, so this is an important talk for me, and I'm really looking forward to it. But to give people some context, would you mind just giving a little bit of background, like how did you get to where you are? Where are you? What are you doing? What's a little bit of your origin story, Joe? I think people are going to find it interesting.
Sure. So, sorry, I do have a baby crying in the background, sort of on cue here. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but
It's no problem, man.
Okay.
This is life.
Okay. So let's see, origin story. So I kind of grew up around complex system science. My dad, as long as I can remember, that's what he did. He did complex systems engineering. So really taking the lessons from complex system science, applying it to engineering systems, which turns out to be very, very different from traditional systems engineering approaches. And maybe we'll end up talking about that. But
Yeah.
so that was something that I was sort of around and sort of gelled with my intuition about the world. And so I ended up going to grad school for, as you said, complex systems and brain sciences down in Boca Raton, Florida, where the brain sciences part is fine and well, but I really went for the complex systems. So I did some fun research there, but it was very insulated, sort of standard academia stuff. So I want to get my hands a little bit more dirty. So
what is complex system science? What is complexity? What is that?
sure. So we usually break down the sciences into kind of these fields, like physics, chemistry, biology, and typically they're broken up by the specific things you're studying. So biology is about studying living systems, organisms, ecosystems. Physics is about material systems. Chemistry is about chemicals. Complex system science takes a slightly different approach where it's essentially agnostic to the things that you're studying. It's more interested in the interactions between things, the organization of things, and how the properties of the systems that we're interested in arise out of those interactions and the organization. So it's less sort of essential, I'm studying biology because I'm studying organisms, and more, well, I'm studying biology because I'm looking at the way systems are structured that are living, and
Okay.
what it is about that system structure that makes a living system, say, distinct from a non-living system. So it's a shift in perspective from the stuff that things are made out of to the patterns that things embody, that they generate, that they
Got it. And so, like in this context, what does complexity mean?
So complexity, to tell you the truth, maybe not too surprising that's a can of worms, because I mean there's like these ideas of computational complexity, which essentially means how long of a description do I need to describe a system.
Okay.
So in that sense, a very complex system is one that needs a very, very long description. A simple system needs a very short description. So you can think of things like, imagine a pattern of stripes, black and white stripes. I could have an infinite series of stripes, but I could describe it very briefly. I say, 4 bars of white, 4 bars of black, 4 bars of white, continue on forever, that kind of thing.
Right.
So that's sort of a compressible description. So that's not a very complex in terms of computational complexity system, but more sort of colloquially and sort of less formally, it also has to do with um, how interdependent the parts of the system are, how much the behavior or the exposure of a part of a system sort of impacts other parts of the system.
Ah, okay.
So you get hitting the foot, and if you feel it because it's traveling through your nervous system, through your brain, and you're having some kind of a emotional and chemical and hormonal response to it, maybe. So clearly your body is very interconnected, and all the parts depend on one another. So complexity can also refer to that kind of interdependency.
And would you say our world is becoming more or less more or less complex?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question, because it's clear that we're having more long range interactions all the time.
Long
But coupled
range.
with coupled with that, we're having a decrease in short range interactions, because we sort of as individual units, we have a bandwidth. We can have, how many interactions a day? 100 interactions a day or something like that. So where are we spreading those? So at a global scale, we're becoming more interconnected. At local scales, we're becoming in a lot of ways more disconnected. Um, and then you have the issue of when you have these large scale events, say like a pandemic, like a coronavirus pandemic, whatever. Um, in some sense, that's actually a very simple event, because it's one thing happening everywhere. If you return to the computational complexity, you
Hmm.
know, all I need to describe is, well, there's one virus, and it's, this is obviously not quite true, but it's evenly spread across the planet, and it's 50% of the people got it. So
Hmm.
it's interesting, because the interconnections and the interactions can lead to very, what you might call, coherent behavior, which is simple in a sense, but it's a kind of pathological simplicity arising out of that interconnectedness.
Interesting. I guess it's like bringing everything into correlation, these kind of events, huh?
That's exactly right. So when everything gets correlated, you might all go up together, but then you all go down together too.
Yeah. And that's a bitch for people that study portfolio theory and want to develop non correlated trades and sort of reduce systemic risk in their portfolio.
Right.
But oopsie daisies, there's incidents in which everything is correlated and there's absolutely nothing you can do. You know something about that kind of work, don't you?
Yeah, yeah, sure. So that's exactly right. And you look over some sample period, and you convince yourself, these two things are independent from one another. But then some much larger event comes out, and you get into what are known as the tails of the distribution, the extreme events, and all of a sudden everything is moving together. So it actually takes an obscene amount of data to look for those things that are really either correlated, or that they have a more generally a tail association. So maybe when things are kind of normal, they're fairly independent seeming, but then when things go wrong, they're kind of failing together.
And this work that you've done, it's brought you in contact with some interesting folks and some people that folks may know about. You've done some good work with Nassim Taleb. In fact, I was under the impression that you'd only done some recent papers with him, but I went back and looked, and there's stuff from years ago. Tell me how you came to that relationship and some of the work that you've been doing with him.
Sure. So I met Nassim when I did a postdoc at the New England Complex Systems Institute up in Cambridge, Mass. He already had a relationship with Yanir Baryam, who's the president there. I came in as a postdoc. I was already a fan of Nassim's. Primarily, I'd read a few of his books, but Anti-Fragile was the one that I read that really hit me. Um, and so I took the opportunity when I saw that relationship to kind of stick my nose into it. And
Perfect.
yeah, right. So
Yeah.
so
I know
Yanir
how that goes.
Yanir loved that.
Yeah.
So I started working on a paper and a theme of papers. We've had several releases around the same topic of the precautionary principle, where the idea is there's certain kinds of risks that at a societal scale are not worth taking, despite their potential benefits, because the downside to if something goes wrong is so catastrophic that they just there's a failure of a kind of cost benefit analysis with that kind of infinite downside. Um,
Yeah, the infinite downside. And I read somewhere you had written a quote about the inevitable death cascade of our current system, which is something that that I want to talk about. And I think it's a theme of what we've got going on. But just to finish the thread here with Nassim, you guys did a paper in what, January or so of this year talking about the pandemic, and you guys were way ahead of the curve in terms of sort of popular understanding of what was going to happen and what's currently happening. And I'm trying to stay a little bit away from Corona talk just so these conversations have a little bit more evergreen nature to them. But I am curious to what was sort of like the pre-conversations like? How did you guys decide to write that paper at that time? What were you seeing? And did anybody listen to you? And what do you what do you think is coming still?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and the idea of I wouldn't want to get too bogged down in talking specifically about coronavirus either, but actually this issue of pandemic is unfortunately likely evergreen. Um,
True, true.
so that's an unfortunate reality, and it comes from what we're talking about with we have all these long range connections now, so things just spread very easily. So yeah, we released that in late January. Wrote it over a weekend, saw what was thanks to Twitter, essentially social media, but Twitter specifically, um, saw the videos coming out of China, saw what was going on. The For me, the big data point was when they started locking down. First, they locked down Wuhan, which is like 11 million people.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to get overly sort of geopolitical here, but I don't think that the CCP is too interested in the kind of the welfare of individuals. So for them to do that, that says that they looked and saw that their nation, their government was at risk.
Right.
So that was a big data point for me, and it's actually more of an important data point than some kind of specific viral parameters that necessarily is going to take you a long time to figure out and track down and study and all of that. So I talked to Nassim about it. I talked to a friend who will go unnamed down in DC about it. Friend said, "Hey, look, what you're saying is making a lot of sense, and I don't see anyone saying it. So if you have a paper or something you can point to, that would be awesome." I didn't have a paper I could point to, so we wrote it.
Yeah.
The big thing is, and this connects to the precautionary principle, the big thing to recognize is that, and this links back to how we think about things in terms of complex systems. It's not all systems are the same, but some systems you can compare in terms of the way they generate their behavior. Contagion, so viral contagion in this case, is kind of the prototypical multiplicative dynamic. So that means that you have one person sick, they get two people sick, they get four people sick. So that's where we get talking about this exponential kind of growth. That comes out of the underlying multiplicative dynamic, and there is just a huge chasm between systems that do and don't have that multiplicative property. And when they do have that property, that means that they can become systemic when the system is interconnected very easily. So you can think of something like, there's a lot of comparisons, for instance, to car accidents. Like, well, only 5 Americans have died so far, and look how many people are dying in car accidents. The thing is, car accidents at a macro scale are not contagious. If
Mm-hmm.
I crash my car into a tree or even into a person up here in New Hampshire, there's not going to be any causal chain of events that's connecting directly some car accident in DC. But with viral contagion, you indeed have those connections. So it's a bit like a forest fire where fire spreads, grows. The difference is the forest tends to stay in place, but people are up moving around. So the multiplicative dynamics just are that much more exacerbated with all the air travel and all that. So we saw that, and the reason to write the paper was actually not because coronavirus specifically, we had any certainty that this is going to be a devastating problem, the specific virus. But the logic is that because you don't know how bad it's going to be, coupled with the fact that it's multiplicative and therefore systemic, then you need to take precautionary actions immediately. And if you're wrong, then you spent some extra money, some extra energy in an overkill, quote unquote, kind of solution. And if you're right, thank God.
Right.
Whereas, if you take the other side of the bet, it'll probably be fine. Then even if you're right in the case of, say, coronavirus or in any specific instance, when you start to stack up those probabilities, because that logic justifies its own reuse, right? Like, well, it's probably fine. So what about the next time when it comes around? Oh, it's probably fine too. It was fine last time. So eventually, there's probably stack up where you get a guarantee that one of these things is going to be absolutely devastating, and we're going to be behind the 8 ball on it. We're not going to be ahead of it. And unfortunately, that's kind of where we are headed. We did these goofy, aimless lockdowns and all this stuff, and it became politically polarized. And it doesn't seem like as a society we learned much of anything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been tough because the messaging hasn't been perfectly clear. The fruits of people's sacrifice hasn't been exactly clear to folks. And then you add on at the end this political mess where public health officials who just yesterday were saying everybody needs to stay home, no weddings, no sporting events, no graduations, no marriages, no church
No
services,
funerals.
no funerals. One day, next day, if you want to protest something that you believe is an important political issue, go right ahead. Hundreds of thousands of people all in the street. Let's have a street party. And that part, I think, is going to do some long-term damage to us as a society because our faith in public health officials and epidemiologists has been diminished. We've seen just some totally just wanton politicization of this event and like discarding something that was told to us as life or death. It's life or death. But if you have a political issue that's based on, some people would say, very flimsy statistics and is probably made up and has not as much relevance as you would think, hey, go right ahead and just protest. And that's going to be damaging. And especially when you talk about how the logic becomes reinforcing. Well, maybe we don't need to do this next time, don't need to do this next time. And what do you know? News out of Beijing today is that they've closed all the school systems, canceled sort of intra-Chinese air travel, and they appear to be freaking out over a resurgence. And I think even they might have said a different kind of strain. So it's I've been telling people we're like barely in the third or fourth inning of this thing, and it's going to go on for the rest of the year, complicated by politics, complicated by elections and protests and rallies, and it's just kind of a mess. Do you feel like, how would you compare our readiness compared today versus January of 2020 for the remainder of this or for the next one that comes?
I mean, my worry is that, like you said, it's not that our readiness hasn't improved. It might have even gotten worse.
Yeah.
Because it's become this thing that's now. When it first rolled in, it was political. It was made to be political, but it was in a different way. And now it's so pervasive that everyone sort of has their position that they've taken, and they're going to stand by it no matter what the empirical evidence seems to suggest. So I feel like we might even be less ready. Maybe we'd have more masks, and they wouldn't lie to us about masks don't work or something.
Right.
But other than that, yeah, I think we might be even worse off. The only thing that maybe we're better off now is that people are a bit primed to shut down air travel. Now,
Yeah.
so one of your questions was, did we have influence? And the feedback that we received is that our paper was used to sort of back the decision to stop the flights from China. And that was the absolute right decision. And at the time, there were attacks saying, oh, it's racist, it's xenophobic, which is absolute insanity. I mean, if we can't stop a virus from being imported, if that in itself is considered racist or xenophobic or somehow morally wrong, then what can you do? What are you able to do in your own interest and defense after that?
Right. Right. What's fascinating is that you complex science guys were ahead of the curve on this. And then some of the more active social media guys, you would call them right wing, maybe former MAGA guys, whatever, new right social media guys, we were on top of this too. And I think that it is partially due to our sort of innate and instinctive feel with these complex systems and the spread of of ideas and memes through our network,
Right.
and the way that we're all connected all around the world. So we could see, because there are parallels, right? There's parallels between information networks and actual physical networks and biological networks and natural networks. There's parallel. It's almost as if it's all related. It's almost as if it all comes from the same place, which we'll get to. And so we had a sense, you could just feel it. And we're used to these things happening and seeing the spread of viruses, whether they be actual or informational. And so we were kind of ahead of the curve, and it's just interesting to see these parallels. And the stage for this, all the negative fallout from our what I've been calling indiscriminate connections, whether it's through the WTO and world trade, whether it's through the ever encroaching span of NATO into places where we probably have no business being, or social media or information technology connectivity. We've seen now the risks involved in that. And one of the things that you've been talking about just briefly with us is these things called long range connections. And that influences memetic and viral spread. Can you talk about what a long range connection is in the context of complex systems, and then also relate it to your experience and understanding of social media and why they're similar and related and why we need to be concerned about that?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the big kind of modeling paradigms that you use in complex systems often are networks. So where networks are just nodes and connections between them. So basically little dots and lines drawn between them. Very simple. The reason that's so common in system science is because of what we are talking about before, because you are so focused on the interactions among the parts. So this becomes a super stripped down representation of parts and their connectedness or their interactions. Um, so if we think about networks, and then we think about, imagine just sort of physical Euclidean space as a network, what kind of a network would that look like? Well, if we think of one dimension, you might imagine a chain of nodes, each connected by a link to its neighbor. That's kind of the space that we came into in this world. That if I want to travel from New England to DC, then I have to go past or through New York City. It's in between them. So, there's all these steps in between one spot and another on the network. Long range connections are where you have one node in one place that gets a direct link across, where it doesn't have to traverse through these other nodes anymore to go far distance. That's the quote unquote long range. The interesting thing about, say, you take this kind of spatial grid network and you say, well, how far am I away from some spot way over on the grid? And you're 1, 2, 3, 4, however many hops that takes you to get there. When you start adding these longer range connections in, it doesn't only bring those 2 points close together, but it also brings their neighbors close together. So very rapidly, you go through a transition where most nodes are really far away in this space from other nodes, to just a handful of long range connections makes any two nodes only a handful of hops away. So this is like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon kind of idea. It's
Right.
like, it doesn't matter who you are, you could be in the middle of the Congo somewhere, you're only like 6 degrees away maximum from Kevin Bacon.
Yeah.
And so it's the intuition that thinking about this way it can build is that transition from everything being far apart to everything being really close together happens very rapidly when you start adding these connections in. And so it's we've already passed that globally. Like, you're 2 hops away from most people, you know, you can get on a plane and be anywhere. And so effectively that kind of shrinks space into a much smaller package. And anything that does have that kind of spreading quality, that cascading quality, just goes through the entire system. I mean, instantly, essentially.
Yeah. And that's what happens with social media, right? So we are now instantly connected to everybody in the world virtually. We can broadcast a signal that anyone can pick up on. So that long range connection doesn't even have to be robust. It doesn't even have to be something massive infrastructure project. They just happen sort of instantly now. And in a historical context, if you zoom way out, we went from nothing to everything in a blink of an eye, basically. And I think it's safe to say that our brains probably haven't caught up. Our society probably hasn't caught up our culture, our norms, our customs haven't caught up to the fact that we have these built-in long-range connections, both physically, for goods, for people, for services, for information, now for ideas and social connections. And so anything can travel basically all around the world to all of us all at once. And I read in one of your papers, you were talking about how we need to start thinking of the world as an ecosystem of organisms and not the organism itself. So in my mind, I'm thinking about this like if we all have long range connections, then basically we're all short range connected in a way, right? And so we kind of have built ourselves into being, and maybe I'm wrong, you can tell me, and we've built ourselves into being like one giant organism. But you've written that you believe it's important for us to look at ourselves as an ecosystem of organisms rather than just one singular organism. Can you expand on that? Tell me if I was right or wrong in what I assumed, and just sort of relate it to what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, so it's definitely related to the connectivity and how close we are to each other, and the fact that if something infects one part of the system, it essentially cascades to the entire system readily. And it's also the centralization of function and the lack of functional redundancy. So, when you look at the way we've centralized global manufacturing to China, yeah, sure, other countries manufacture, but no one's the manufacturing powerhouse like China. So, what happens when China manufacturing goes down? Well, that has massive effects on the entire globe. It's a bit similar to, you have a heart attack. How does that affect the rest of your body? Well, it has massive effects on the rest of your body. So in that paper, I was in part responding to, I've seen from several sources, several perspectives, offer that kind of solution for the global problems is to become like a superorganism at the global scale. But organisms have this property of these single points of failure, of these centralized functions, and so we don't want to be that. It's great when things are working well, and when they go wrong, it's a catastrophe. So at a minimum, we need to be uh, a planet of several organisms, such that as sad as it is, when one organism dies, it doesn't kill off the whole species. It doesn't kill off the whole ecosystem. The larger system that's embedded in is able to go on. In many cases, even evolve and become something better, stronger, or at least different. And
Right.
that's kind of like an ecosystem. An ecosystem is not uh, it doesn't have a well-defined trajectory like a single organism where there's sort of this development unfolding and then senescence and death. It's something that is contains organisms that interact and evolve within that system and kind of have an open-ended quality to them where the forms that an ecosystem can take over long periods of time are either very difficult to determine or maybe even indeterminate. So we need to be able to evolve. We need to not be so
Uh,
rigid that
there you go.
a single thing can take us out. And so an organism is just the wrong model.
Right. So globalism basically was this idea that we'd all become super connected and that would be great for everybody. But what we're learning right now, and again, related to social media, because mimetic infection is the same way, and viral infection is also the same way. This super connectivity that we have actually is bringing in additional risk that we had not considered. And what's fascinating for me is that I've been working on all of these subjects, sort of all the food that went into this mess, talking to guys like Sam Hammonds about the China shock doctrine, where we basically just handed over our manufacturing and important national defense manufacturing and pharmaceutical manufacturing all over to China. I've been talking to Jordan Hall about designing systems that for emergence rather than for a specific goal. And that's what I've done with the liminal order. We didn't set out to achieve a specific thing. We designed a system that would foster emergence, and that's what we've seen that happening. And then so when we start to see what we've done in response to Corona, social distancing, and I was talking to Jeffrey Miller about this, and he reminded me of the subject of adaptive disconnection, which is found in biology and nature, and we now I see a parallel to social distancing as well. So can you explain a little bit about what adaptive disconnection is, and how that might be something favorable? And just one last thought before you answer that: when we are one organism, there's no healthy competition. And that is a bad thing, right? We need to have an open landscape of competition so that we can have the best ideas and the best outcomes bubble up to the surface in the long run. And again, that's sort of, if you just put that in a political context, it's almost defines the differences between the right and the left. Is that we want to have an environment that breeds for emergence, that breeds competition, that's going to give us our healthiest outcome, that involves things like adaptive disconnection and avoids things like this indiscriminate connectivity that we've had, where you become one organism, and if something fails within the organism, the whole thing dies. So what can we do? What help us put this in more context, and talk to me about adaptive disconnection and relate it to its existence in biology and then into our sort of social life that we just did in response to Corona.
Well, so you know, one of the possible responses to issues of contagion, pandemic, systemic risk is to decouple, is to be relatively independent systems. The downside of that is there's a lot of opportunities in being connected, into trading goods, long range, into all of those things. So a kind of compromise is a system that takes the opportunity to have long range connections, and to, if some country does a really good job with something and you want to get that stuff from them, then go ahead and do that. But then when you detect that something spreading is happening, if there's some systemic risk starting to grow and unfold, then you're able to say, you know what, we're gonna stop international flights and kind of see what's going on, and reorient and observe. And a lot of the disconnection from my perspective should be that way. It shouldn't be thought of as a solution so much as a way to slow down the dynamics and to orient, bit of an OODA loop type of thing, where you're
Mm,
kind of getting the opportunity to orient to the environment and then make better informed decisions. Buy yourself a little time. So, um, and this goes back to, when Trump shut down flights from China, the better call would have been to shut down all international flights.
right.
We got a ton of stuff from Italy. Not that surprising. I mean, maybe it's surprising that's from Italy specifically, but that it was somewhere else too,
Yeah.
and came in anyway, should not have been a surprise.
Yeah.
And so that ability to say, hey, we're going to pause these connections for now. We know that we either will resume them later, or that in many cases we'll need to resume them later, but for this moment we're going to pause them. So we did it. We did it reluctantly. It The reason we're reluctant is because how much it will cost, and it ends up
Yeah.
costing more because we wait.
Right.
Um, so that's the adaptive part of that, rather than adaptive to imply dynamic and context sensitive, as opposed to sort of something rigid, structured, fixed forever in time.
Right. So it sounds like we need to build into this system triggers and fail safe systems, basically, where, I mean, like a fuse or something, right? Like in the old days, if the circuit overheats, the thing just pops and cuts everything off to protect the house. I mean, that's a pretty good analogy. And it seems to me that we need something like that with all of our physical connections. I've also seen people talking about how to regulate social media in such a way. Now, I don't know how we're going to do this, but I've seen people suggest that a solution to, like, viral spread of fake news or panic or whatever is some sort of throttling on social media as well, which fits in sort of theoretically within the same conversation. I don't know how we go about doing that in practice, though, especially because of all and this is the same struggle, right? All the benefits that come from these connections and the speed at which they occur, but there's also some serious downsides. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So the difference I see between these two, I mean, there's a few differences, obviously, but one of the important differences is the fact that for the kind of throttling it sounds like you're describing, that would almost be like the central control, central command, like throttling it down with some AI or some BS like that.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking about, we need to be able to adaptively decouple our trade relations, I'm not saying that there needs to be some authority that's propped up that decides when that happens. I'm actually saying that we, as say a sovereign nation, make that decision. We're not letting anyone in right now. We're decoupling.
Right.
So social media already has a lot of that. I mean, I use the block button liberally, and I think you do too.
Yes, I sure
And
do.
Twitter would be unusable without that.
Yes.
And there's a lot of people complain about echo chambers and tribalism and things like that. But actually, that's the way I see that is a kind of reemergence of our localist tendencies in the virtual space.
Yes.
We need boundaries. We need to know who's on the inside and who is on the outside. What is the system? What is the environment? In system science, one of the first things you do if you're analyzing something is to make that decision in your analysis. What's the system and what's the environment?
Mm.
That's there's It's not that there's no objective means of deciding where that exists. There are some, but in many ways it's also a judgment call. If I'm interested, for instance, let's say I'm interested in studying the nervous system. Do I then consider the nervous system to have a boundary and its environment is the rest of the body? Or is the whole organism the system, and the environment is what it's interacting with? So these basic sort of bounded patterns are essential in all of the systems that we're embedded in, that we generate. And one of the things that I think we've seen and is related to all of this is this sort of through the modern period, a um, a belief that boundaries in general are somehow antiquated, not necessary, um, whatever backwards. And that's just couldn't be further from the truth. And moreover, the idea that if we eliminated boundaries, what we get is integration. And actually, when you have a system that needs to work, let's say you're doing software development or something, to get a very complex piece of software to integrate properly demands that you draw appropriate boundaries around the components. So these two things are not actually completely in concert. They're not in contradiction at all. We need to have the right boundaries that allow the system to integrate properly at multiple scales.
Man, it's so fascinating to me how many parallels there are between this, social media, biology, viruses, politics, wokeism spreading all over the place. When it comes to social media and me blocking, I'm not blocking to create an echo chamber. I'm blocking to get rid of idiots. And what I want are people that are engaged in actual conversation. So that's my tribe. My tribe is people engaged in actual research, conversation, and analysis. That's why I'll slam Trump when he needs it, and I'll praise him when he deserves it. I troll people off my timeline all the time by talking shit about Trump. Just be like, get out of here, you red meat people. You don't need to be here. But we're doing the same thing in the liminal order too. We've experienced the negative side effects of being indiscriminately connected. Myself, I got doxxed by an information attack by Antifa, and they ruined my life in many ways. And I realized that I was just totally out there and exposed with all of my connectors, like saying engage, engage, engage. But instead, I needed to erect a little bit of a barrier and give myself a chance to build some strength. And that's what we're sort of paralleling in the liminal order, is creating a high trust, high value network where
Mhm.
we can do what we need to do inside and then selectively engage on the outside. I'm just continuously fascinated by all of these parallels, and unfortunately, unfortunately, this phrase "inevitable death cascade" keeps coming to mind, because if the system keeps up at the way it's going, and this complexity continues, and these long range connections continue without any discrimination whatsoever, it seems to me that you have a feeling that, quote, extinction becomes certain. So can we talk about how that all plays together in our system and the trajectory that we're on? What do we do to prevent the inevitable death cascade and the extinction becoming certain due to our connectivity in the system that we have built for ourselves?
So I mean, there's basically one place that we're going, and that is a less connected system. And there's two ways of getting there. There's sort of the thoughtful, intentional way, and the kind of kicking and screaming way. And essentially, our institutions, our systems, the legacy systems that we continue to depend on, can't handle either the complexity or the scale of the events that are now commonplace. And so when they can't handle that, then they will break and something else will take their place. Um, the US is a really special place in terms of it was so intentionally set up as a federated system. I mean, we have 50 states. That's no small number. And this idea of 50 laboratories or libertarianism idea of that, we could make the political decisions to start to devolve and return to that. And everyone would experience much more harmony. And where failure occurred, it would be at a much smaller scale. And so you'd sort of have the benefits of many places things working a lot better, and as well as the risk reduction of when things don't work well, the scale at which that happens is a lot smaller. And this is really related to this idea of localism and bringing decisions as close to home as possible. And for different kinds of issues, that scale is different. Some things are right to take care of on the homestead, some are right to take care of in town, some are right in the state, and some are right at the nation. And that's exactly how we've been set up is with a recognition that there's really these different scales of behaviors and of problems, and the system needs to have those scales to match those issues. And I do think there is some hope in that happening. Funny enough, even though it's a bit of a kind of a comic strip in many ways, this Chaz thing going on, this autonomous zone, it doesn't surprise me at all. Decentralization is where we're going. These are people that feel that they have a certain set of values and cultural practices and all of these things that they feel are very important to them. And so what do? They made a coherent area, formed a boundary, said when you're on the inside, you're in Chaz. When you're on the outside, you're out of Chaz. And here's how we do things in Chaz. They like I said, it's a bit of a joke because they're not really set up to feed themselves and all of that, or trade for food or anything like that. But nevertheless, the sort of it's a symptom of something deeper that's happening everywhere with all of us. So the thing about localism, there's so many ways to start to penetrate that because it's a kind of a metasystem structure that would allow many more natural organic patterns to unfold. And so it's a hard thing to penetrate because it's like, well, do you do it for this reason or that reason? It's kind of all of the above. But yeah, I mean, local autonomy, local sovereignty, and scaling up decision making only when it's necessary. So that's the subsidiarity principle. Is that could get us by without that inevitable death cascade.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the autonomous zones. I'm getting like excited because these issues are so relevant to me, my personal life, my work, the country. I've had lately, Joe. I've had like a singularity lately, where like all these issues I've been working on, starting with radical feminism and wokeism and Antifa and emergent networks and information warfare and 4G warfare and connectivity and disconnection versus connection. All of it's happening all at once. And then the riots happened in my own backyard. So I knew all the players and all the streets and all the everything. It's just like this singularity for me, all happening all at once. So it's actually been, I mean, it's a sad moment in America in many ways, but it's been really exciting for me, if I'm allowed to be so crass, because this is just what I've been working on, thinking on so much. And the autonomous zones, it's something that I wanted to talk to you about. It fits in within an adaptive disconnection model, right? It fits in with a decentralization model. It's also what I see as a natural extension of the existing sanctuary cities and counties and states that we've had in the United States for years, actually now. And that's both on the left and the right. You've got immigration sanctuary cities. You've got Second Amendment gun sanctuary counties in Virginia. Now you've got an actual autonomous zone in Washington State, Chaz, as it's been called. And frankly, I got to say, I don't support their agenda. I kind of support what they're doing in a way, because if you fast forward many years from now, it's entirely possible that there's going to be more of these, right? And based around a number of different issues, whether it's my kind of issues, my values, or their values, or whatever, this decentralization theme is we can't stop it. It's what's happening, and it's because of the system. And the federal government had been moving towards this centralization for so many years, starting really back like around late 19th century, early 20th century, and it's just been growing and growing and growing, and then spreading that into the world community and trying to centralize everything. WTO, we're going to decide everything. United Nations decide everything. But here we go. We've got an autonomous zone. We're exactly right. They've set up a border. They've adaptively disconnected from the network that they don't like, and they're giving it a shot, right? And my advice to Trump right now is just to let it go and just see what happens. It's not going to work for them in the long run because they didn't start with like a farm, right? They didn't start with the things that you need, and it's just sort of a frolic or a lark for them, I think. And in a 4G warfare context, they've gone from fighting a network war, an insurgency war, to basically like creating a trench and holding the line. So I'm happy to see them distracted by that. Go ahead and hold your territory while the network war rages on. I like to see that. So you brought up localism, which was sort of our crescendo here. I want to get to that. This is your answer, or at least one of your answers to this complexity problem, the inevitable extinction, the death cascade, the problems of long-range connections. Localism. Tell me what you mean by localism. How do you live localism in your life? What do we do to spread this idea? You fought with me about nationalism. I'm saying nationalism is self-care. And you're like, no, not nationalism, localism, which is fine. All on the same vibe, right? On the same path. So tell me what it means to you. How are you living it? How do we spread this idea, et cetera, et cetera? Lay it on me, Joe. This is where I wanted to go.
All right. So localism. Let's just start with how I'm living it.
Yes.
We moved to a spot in New Hampshire almost 2 years ago now. We moved with the idea of living a more local life. Primarily that's centered around food, where we get our food, what we're eating, how we prepare it, all of that. So one of the nice things about this area is that it's kind of hilly and rocky, and so it was actually spared the industrial agriculture spread sort of takeover. So we have a lot of nice legacy small farms around here where people are, they're not necessarily paying for their USDA organic sticker, but they don't need to. They do everything the old-fashioned way. They build a compost pile and there's no chemicals, no nothing. So we're really fortunate to get, I could say, close to 100% of our food comes from within 15 miles of us.
Nice.
That was kind of the first thing. Then, of course, we bought a property that has a few acres and started growing our own food, got chickens, started learning how to cultivate the land, learning how to manage the forests. So all of that, the truth is that work takes a really long time to learn. For one thing, because I'm not doing it full time. I'm working as a data scientist a lot of the time, so I'm attached to the computer like so many other people. Nevertheless, so many of those iterations are 1 year. So it takes 1 year to kind of do something and to figure out, was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing? Did it matter at all? So it's very slow, and I think that a lot of, frankly, what we lost in terms of know-how will take a long time to recover, because a lot of people got to put a lot of time into building those skills back up to have a sort of genuine, robust localist system. So that's what we're doing in our life. And actually, recently I can add another thing on there. You mentioned in the beginning up front. Sorry, I can't remember if this was before we started recording or not, but we had a fire on our property. Sucked. But the volunteer fire department showed up in 5 minutes. And so that was incredible. I couldn't believe,
Wow.
I mean, I just couldn't believe it. I was like, they're here already? That's amazing. Wow. So I'm also now training to be a volunteer firefighter. So that's something. Actually, a few hours after this, I'm going to learn how to cut up cars. So for extraction.
Wow.
So that'd be cool.
Yeah.
So in addition to the food stuff, it's building relationships. We live in a really small town, talk to people, talk to the neighbors. Doesn't mean I always get along with them. They're also not necessarily on the localist vibe, right? Like in a general sense, it's present around here. It's kind of in the air. But at the same time, everyone's part of this modernist era. So it's for me been just allowing myself to get a bit uncomfortable with talking to the people who grow my food, talking to the people around town. You know, the board of selectmen, go in there and talk to them. Um, the cops, go to talk to them. Just literally talk to everybody that I can that's in my town, um, and feel the push and pull. And also, part of one of the implications of complexity is that essentially in a complex system impossible to know how things will evolve. The predictability goes out the window. So I'm also in my personal kind of localist endeavors, I'm not trying to fulfill one specific vision or one idea or one plan of what's going to unfold. I'm allowing myself to be an agent in a larger system, that's interacting, having local micro interactions, and seeing what unfolds and kind of observing that. And this like volunteer firefighting thing is a perfect example of that. Like, that was not part of the plan, but they came to put out my fire. They were awesome guys. They said, "You ever thought about fighting fires?" And I said, "Now I'm thinking about it." Um, so that's a bit of it. So that's on me. In general, we have these issues we talk about, long range connections, building some of that down with circuit breakers you mentioned, boundaries and whatnot, can de-risk us globally, so that when failures happen, they're bounded and not sort of global in scale. Um, that means more decision making brought home. Um, that means that town hall matters. It's not some extra thing. And this is, you mentioned I push back on nationalism. The issue with nationalism, and you know obviously I don't want to do kind of a word thinking thing here where we're like, oh, nationalism is bad because nationalism is bad, but
Right.
but
Right.
as a general kind of connotation that comes along with it, it's sort of, you know you either have globalism, which says that the globe is the one system and we need to make decisions at that scale, and one interpretation of nationalism is a similar thing, just at the national scale, sort of this one decision making body. But much like biological systems, which we are, we should be structured in sort of gradations of scale. So it's natural to have things at a few hundred people. That's a unit. Now a few groups of a few hundred people. That's another unit. A few groups of those groups. That's another unit. So this kind of nested scales, this sort of hierarchy of scales, is a very natural thing. And the reason I push back on the word nationalism is so that doesn't get lost. Every person is an individual. We kind of know and understand that some individuals are similar to others, but everybody's unique. Places ought to have the same character. They used to, but we've started to homogenize them. um, so once again, a place kind of should have a feel, should have a personality, should kind of be quote unquote somebody. And so localism is also about that, that letting a place have its character and find its character. Um, there's also the fact that, when you put your money into something, where does it go? Well, guess what? If it goes straight down the street, to my neighbor who's farming, his farm gets better. Now, when I drive up the street, it's a more pleasant drive. So there's this kind of local effect of the capital circulating very locally, that can engage these kind of positive feedback loops. Um, and then, once we're overflowing with abundance in my neighborhood, then we're able to not only feed ourselves, but to help our the next town over, something like that, when they're in need. Um, so localism is all about that. Like, what's the proper scale of the decision making? What's the density of the interconnections and interdependencies among people that live physically near one another? Um, so in this case, I see a localism as, rather than a sort of, it's just making things less complex or more complex or something like that. It's actually reducing complexity at these very large scales, global scales, nation state scales, but increasing that complexity and that interdependence very locally. Um, so that in fact, the local situation does look more like a single organism. And you could have that cascade failure in that local organism then, but it doesn't spread the same way. What else? What else?
I mean, that's absolutely fascinating to me. It struck me as you were talking that it's a sign of our times that it takes effort to do things the old right way,
Yes.
and it's easy to do things the new bad way.
Yeah.
Having to relearn how to fucking farm. That sounds like an insane thing to say, but that's where we are. We're even needing to relearn how to make local social connections.
Yep.
How to get involved with other people. And we're also relearning the value of getting involved locally. If you want a really great contemporary example, if you don't go to your PTA meeting, then one day you will wake up and in your children's inbox will be White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo telling them that they are innately and incurably racist and that they should throw themselves on the floor at the feet of critical theory. And I use this, it's sort of an exaggerated example, but it's absolutely 100% applicable. If you don't go to your local meetings, if you don't go to the town hall, if you don't vote in your local elections, then people who do go are going to make decisions for you, and you may or may not like that. And the other, and James Lindsay in our podcast that I did with him, he really pointed that out to me as a solution to some of this issue. All the macro yelling and screaming, Black Lives Matter and blah, 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 all that is noise. The real rubber hits the road in your local school meetings, in your local committee meetings, and you got to just suck it up and go to the meetings and raise your hand, because guess what? There'll probably be other people there that wish they had the balls to step up, and they'll be happy to stand behind you. If there's one thing I have discovered over the last 5 years, if you display an act of courage, you can turn around and all of a sudden there'll be people behind you wanting to follow and wanting to go where you're going. And that's what we need. It's like an epidemic, a pandemic of acts of courage. That's what we need today. Another thing that I was struck by when you were talking is that how would you rate this? Homogeneity seems to be anti-adaptive, right? Like, you're talking about putting all the same shit in all the places everywhere, irrespective of the local conditions, the people, the customs and norms, even the genetics of the people that settled there, even the terrain, even whatever. Homogeneity seems to be bad for us on an evolutionary scale. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's just absolutely correct. The thing is, evolution works by variety, production of variety, and then selection, and sort of continuous iteration of those two things. Without the variety, there's nothing to select. You either make it or you don't, and one of these days something will come along where you don't, and there's nothing to continue on. So there's actually something from cybernetic system science control theory called the Law of Requisite Variety,
Hmm.
and it says that you need your system that's responding to the environment to be at least as complex, to have at least as much variety as the environment, so that it can respond to it. And this is
Hmm.
exactly that issue.
Hmm.
Um,
That's fascinating. We've seen evolution in political theory on this same subject matter as well. You've got the United States, interestingly, preaching plurality at home, but practicing unipolar politics and ways of life and civilizational organization abroad. And then you got a guy like Alexander Dugin, who I was introduced to through Michael Millerman in Canada, teaching me, and I'm not saying I believe all of this stuff or everything that he says, but he taught me about how the fourth political theory is about creating a space that actually appreciates political pluralism. And if that doesn't scream like competition, variety, and selection, I don't know what does. I remember when I was in undergrad in the 90s, it was the tail end or just after the end of the Cold War. And I wrote my thesis on the necessity of competition for economic systems, right? So that we could see what works and what doesn't. And I saw the communist capitalist competition, and we saw who won. But when we don't have anything else and no variety, I don't know how we can select further. And just one little other tangent: I was watching a documentary last night on the font Helvetica. And it was amazing to see how in this design community, Helvetica became like the most popularly used font in the world. And some of the guys in that world thought that like Helvetica was like the final evolution of font, right? And so they're like, what do we do next? There was even like an anti-Helvetica movement where they shredded it apart and tried to go somewhere else, but then there's like a return to it. So it's just interesting parallel that we're seeing in all these things. It almost makes you think that we're all connected and that we all kind of come from the same. And when I say we, I mean the earth, the galaxy, the universe, us, our DNA, our cells, our biological systems, they all seem to have similar themes, right? So like we're all people say we're all just stardust. It's actually kind of true, right? The DNA for the universe might be just the same as the DNA for us. What do you think about that? I don't mean precisely, but you understand what I'm saying.
So, I mean, it's pretty clear that we are all in the same world, and we are of the world. We come out of it. At risk of getting too kind of woo woo, Alan Watts, if you're familiar, talked
Yeah.
about how the universe peoples like an apple tree apples. I think that's a good visual of kind of how
Yep.
that goes. So what we share is not some code or we're not. I don't believe we're in a simulation or anything like that, but rather these kind of principles of pattern formation. And there's these, and this is one of the reasons that I was drawn to complexity in the first place, is that it's that you get this rich variety out of a few fundamental principles of how patterns come into being. That's sort of the opposite of the law of entropy, right? Entropy is about patterns disappearing. It's
Mm.
about things disintegrating. But what we observe in the world is not just that, but patterns forming, patterns growing.
Hmm.
And I think that some of these issues, when we're talking about um, boundaries and borders, these are some of the basic pattern elements that you see over and over and over again, no matter what kind of a system you're looking at. So there's clearly some principles at play here that we can look to, and it's in the combinations of those principles and those patterns that you get this essentially infinite variety of possibilities. So there's this deep uniting set of pattern principles that kind of everything obeys, because if it didn't, the thing would fall apart, it wouldn't exist. And then there's the fact that when you recombine these things, the novelty is endless.
Uh, Something came to mind just now: boundaries and health. We even see that in personal relationships, in emotional
For
relationships,
sure.
right? Like, if you don't have boundaries emotionally between you and your spouse, or you and your friends, or just random people on the street, that disrupts your own internal emotional thermostat, right? Like, you can get out of whack if you don't have a boundary. And it doesn't have to be mean or anything, but you can just like say, no, I'm not comfortable with that, or no, that's just not for me. And it's fascinating to me to see that even in just the noises we make with our throats and the telepathy that we do, like, we need to have a boundary there too, right? There's boundaries everywhere. And in fact, if you really think about it, since we're both mostly made up of space, right, in our atoms, in our construction, our molecular construction, really we are just a boundary around space, even just physically in our manifestation to the world. I just love seeing how all these things come together. One of my favorite things, I think one of my top skills I test out at, is ideation, and just being able to see how everything fits together and identify patterns. But one thing you just mentioned that struck me really was, you said entropy versus pattern creation. Now, I'm not a physicist, but isn't some law of entropy, isn't that like a universal law, like, of physics?
Second
And
law of thermodynamics is
yes.
entropy is always increasing
Okay.
in an isolated system.
Uh-huh.
What we observe are not isolated systems, we observe open systems. So all of
Okay.
that physics that follows from isolated systems, we started applying sort of liberally to the world at large. And it turns out that most of the things in the world are indeed not isolated at all. And even to develop those theories of isolated systems, what did people have to do? They had to create
Crazy bad.
crazy, like contrived experimental situations so that a system could be more or less isolated. Not really, but it's got like insulated surfaces and whatnot. So open systems are what we actually deal with in the world, and the second law of thermodynamics has not much to say about those. So then when people say, yeah, but in general, like in the whole universe, it's going towards entropy. That's actually making an assertion about the structure of the universe that I don't think
Yes.
anyone is able to make with any confidence. You can feel more or less compelled by a particular model of the universe, but the idea that that debate is over is absurd, of course.
What, that there's only one universe, or it's a closed system?
Yeah, or that we know any,
Open
or that we
system.
can make any claim like that and feel like we know what we're talking about. Obviously,
Right.
we can build models, test the predictions of those models, and feel more or less confident, but that's about it.
So, how radical of an idea is it to say that the second law of thermodynamics, it doesn't apply to our closed systems that we operate in? Is that radical? Is that widely accepted?
It's widely accepted that open systems you need something else theoretically. Um, that it doesn't apply is I think that it does apply, but under those very specific conditions of isolation.
Okay.
So when if I stop maintaining my house, it's going to fall apart.
Right.
And that's not because it's strongly isolated, but because the kinds of inputs it needs will not be there anymore to maintain its form.
Are there gradations of open and closed systems? If we move towards a more open system with long range connections and stuff like that, does that increase entropy?
So, okay, let me think about this for a minute. So one of the things I want to mention to connect it back to what we were talking about is that when we're talking about boundaries. You were talking about the making sure that not everything goes through kind of boundary.
Yeah.
But living boundaries are selectively permeable. So it's not about things go in or they don't. It's about that
Mm.
the agent or the system is making decisions about what comes in and what doesn't. So that's one thing that's really important about thinking about boundaries, because if you have a boundary around something and nothing gets in, then indeed, yeah, you'll get the second law will take over and you'll get nothing but entropy. So you have to take in something.
Yeah.
So a lot of these questions revolve around what are those decisions, who makes them, um, and then what follows from those. And I think you nailed it earlier. You mentioned something about like a high trust inside, and that's exactly like a cell in your body is able to kind of trust what's going on inside of the membrane, and it has less trust about what's going on outside the membrane. And it might decide that you're a viral particle and I don't want to let you in. So I think that's really important. It's not that boundaries are for pure isolation. It's that they're for selective interaction.
Mm. Discriminate strategic disconnection, the end of the age of indiscriminate connection. You may not have an answer to this, so I apologize if I'm putting you out there, but do you know in the history and just literature that you've studied, like where this idea that it was okay or a good idea to just reach out and reach out and reach out and connect and connect and connect and connect, where did that come from? Like how it seems to me like that's a fundamental grand strategic error. And yet somehow it seemed to have been driving everything. Was it just emergent? Was it just what we had to do in order to find that boundary and decide to pull, or, where the boundary should be and decide to pull back or become more selective with who passes through the membrane? Because I don't hear, this is not like a general theme out there right now. Like, oh, we need to be more selectively disconnected, right? That's going to take decades to change that boat around. But do you have any idea, like just with talking to your dad or who knows what, like just in your past experience of where you could see this coming from? I don't have the answer. I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, I'm no historian, but I mean, you look at history and you see that with increasing connectivity for humans physically is related to increased speed of transportation, and so you get these local competitive advantages. If I'm able to bring in a lot of metal from a distant land and create weapons out of that, I have a distinct advantage. Or if I'm even just able to trade easily, on the Silk Road or something, or getting spices. So there's obviously these benefits to long range connections. Um, and my sense is that it's just something we never reflected on. We just kind of kept
Mm.
going, kept going. And
Yeah.
so I think there's two things. There's the long range connections and the centralization. And I'm more confident to say that the kind of centralization that we default to today is, if not generated from, at least extremely kind of catalyzed by, exacerbated by the Industrial Revolution, where you were focused on repeatable processes that could be scaled up, and workers that could be changed out and be fungible and kind of be parts of a large machine type of vision. Um, so I think that those two things are distinct but related, the long range connections and the centralization of and scaling up of processes. Um,
What's interesting, I've had conversation with Jordan Hall about this a number of times, talking about how he calls it game A and game B societies. And game A society was basically scaling up of our hunter-gatherer tribe. And inside the hunter-gatherer tribe, there probably is some element of centralization, and it's even probably like communist in some ways. And it's like, we're going to decide to do this, we're all going to go do that, and then we're going to share this stuff around. Even if it scales all the way down. If you've read Sex at Dawn, it scales down into even like sexual relationships and whatnot, according to some people. But basically, game A is us scaling that up to a point now where it just doesn't fucking work. It just doesn't work, right? I don't know why we thought something that would work for 30 people is going to work for 300 million people or 7 billion people if some people have their way, right? And so what he has described is the evolution now of game B. He doesn't know what it is just yet. Nobody really does, but it is based on themes of decentralization, localization, emergence. And when you combine that with technology, then it becomes, you can now create the tribe that you miss from the old days with people that share your values, not just the people that are nearby you, right? And so we're starting to be able to form communities based on values, irrespective of where you are physically. And that is a major, major change for us, because not only does that mean you can find your tribesmen, you may be in California, but it also means you're actually living next door to people who may not be in your tribe too. So what do you think about that? And are you participating in that to some degree too, aren't you?
oh yeah, absolutely. So I think that, like to your later point, that you might be living next to people who are in a different tribe. There's real problems with this. You're getting this kind of, we're not sorting out spatially. We're sorting out by values virtually, and we're not sorting out spatially. So what are those relationships now with your neighbors? I think one of the important things, though, to recognize about localism is that you're not always going to be best friends with your neighbor, even in the best case scenario. It's just not realistic. G.K. Chesterton talked about this, and he talked about how, often it's portrayed that the city is sort of, it's a cosmopolitan, everything's there, this massive variety. And the countryside is some, homogenous place where everyone's the same. And from the experience of the individual, it couldn't be more opposite, because when you're in the city, you can seek out those like-minded people. You get together once a week. That's your crew, where you all see things the same way. In the country, there's no one to choose from. So you better learn to get along with whoever the hell's out there, or move.
Right.
So there's a bit of, I think for this kind of localist vision to to be realized, there has to be some willingness for people to get up and move around, and then move around less after that.
Yeah.
I think there also has to be sort of large scale assurances on the ability to get up and leave a place. I think that's something that does deserve to be a large scale shared value, that you shouldn't be trapped somewhere, physically held in, like in North Korea or something. Um, and the reason being, so that if you don't make sense in a place, or a place doesn't make sense to you, you go find the place that does make sense. Um, so there's a bit of both, I think, that needs to happen. One is that we figure out where we should go and get up and move around a bit, and two, learn how to have neighbors again, and learn
Yeah.
that isn't always pretty.
Right. And good walls make good neighbors.
Yep.
That's a truism for a reason. Interesting comment there on mobility. One of the assumptions in globalization is that labor mobility
Mhm.
is perfect. And even within the global economy and also domestically. And what we've seen actually is that that's not true, and that labor mobility is not perfect, and that when you do ship out capital and you do ship out products and services and businesses away, people like to stay where they are, where their family is, where their community is, where they were born. They never thought they would leave. So there is some friction there in what you're talking about, and what's happened in globalism. The failure of labor mobility to be perfect is pretty much the fundamental failure of globalism, besides the choke points and the strategic errors of manufacturing and whatnot, that people were just going to somehow their local space was fungible, as you said earlier, that they would just say, "Oh fuck it, I lived in Youngstown, Ohio, my whole life, but now I need to move to Nogales, Mexico. All right, fuck it, I'll do it." But no, it just doesn't happen like that. So there's an interesting element to be considered there when you talk about people needing to be free to move to find the right place. There has to be a sort of freedom in ourselves also to allow that to happen. I personally have been looking at land. Like, I've been in DC for almost 30 years, basically. I loved living in the city. I just use past tense, man. That's sad. I loved living in the city. I'm a city kid, born, raised here, grew up on the block, like built institutions and real estate and communities in the city. But I'm coming to accept that this is probably not my place. And I've been looking at acreage in basically, I would call it Appalachian, like some stretch out there that spans through Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, up into New York. That seems to be calling my name right now. And the amount of acreage you can get and the ability that we have these days to build off the grid and to, fit into the nature there rather than dominate it. Like, these things are really attractive to me. And, combine what happened with Corona exploding for all of us to see that work can be done anywhere. Holy cow. And that all this driving and commuting and water cooler and lunch bullshit that we all engaged in was totally unnecessary. In fact, probably counterproductive. So I think we're going to see an explosion in this type of thinking. Are you seeing that? Are you getting vibes like that too? I mean, how have the last 6 months between Corona, globalization, China virus, the riots and protests, tribalism on a national scale playing out? How do you see this impacting us moving forward? And are you getting vibes? Is it having change? Are people being motivated to move and do things?
I mean, anecdotally, yes. Number of my friends, just since this whole coronavirus thing started unfolding, have moved from the Boston or surrounding towns into New Hampshire, just like that. During the lockdown, shopped their real estate, bought their house, said, "I'm getting the hell out of here." In general, I think large cities are going to keep being, they're kind of the places that connect the globe, right? These large cities. That's where the airports are. That's the connection. Um, they're going to keep feeling these extreme events pretty hard, I think, as we go forward. It's these things seem, depending on how you think about it, but seem unrelated. And you have the coronavirus and you have these riots and stuff. But this is like, these are cascades, and there's going to be more of them until we do disconnect a bit more. And
All right,
so,
keep going.
yeah, and so for myself, I mean, like I said, we've been in our home for about 2 years now. We didn't move here without this awareness. I mean, what's happening? We sort of looked around and say, "Oh wow, didn't we get lucky?" We said, "Oh wow, I'm glad that we made that decision now, or when we did, because look what's happening now. I'm glad I'm not dealing with that so in my face."
Yeah.
Um, so, part of the reason we were able to release that paper in January was because we weren't surprised by any of this. We've been sort of keeping our eye out. We know this stuff is coming. So, but I think people do like urban settings, density. I think you're seeing more and more interest in kind of classical urban architecture, walkable spaces, fewer cars, things like that. What I think many people are going to start realizing is that you can have a lot of that, and you can have the countryside, and you can be in a little, what I'm calling, micro city, or on the
Mm.
edge of a micro city that you've never heard of before, and has, let's say 40 restaurants and a few clubs or whatever. It's sort of enough to get that, what you get out of the city, enough to get that out of it without being these massive, sprawling, uh,
Seething.
seething, sure, yeah, these sort of danger zones, So I'm kind of long on what I'm calling micro cities, and especially where they're not surrounded by suburbia, but actual countryside. Sort of that
Yeah.
hard delineation between them. None of that in between stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And I say this as like an avowed urbanist, right? Like, I loved living in the city. I loved getting up and walking to the yoga studio, going to my CrossFit gym, getting coffee, walking to work, taking my kids to the local park, all the arts, all the anything. But maybe in 30 years, maybe I've chewed it all up. I'm not sure. We'll see. The land in West Virginia looks really appealing, and it is beautiful. And I can't go to Pennsylvania. I can't go to Virginia because I just don't. Their political future is a little too uncertain for me. Whereas I think West Virginia seems pretty solid. Definitely a place where they won't call the cops on you for lifting weights in your front yard, as has happened to me 4 times now in Washington D.C. You mentioned something about cascades and cascading effects, and there's a concept in complexity that I wanted to talk to you about: self-organized criticality. And I would give a primer, but you can give the primer. But basically, the idea is I want to understand how in this systems event, how this is applying to us societally, and if we can expect to see events like that. So assume the audience doesn't know what it means, and just give us a quick primer on it, and see if we can relate it to like our current culture and cultural events.
Sure. So the classic model that's used to talk about this self-organized criticality, quote unquote, is the sand pile model, which is the idea that you build up, you drop sand onto a pile, and you keep dropping that sand and build up the pile over time. As you're dropping more sand onto it, you get avalanches around the pile. Those avalanches have different sizes. Sometimes it's a few grains of sand kind of tumbling down. Sometimes it's kind of the whole side of the pile will go. So this huge avalanche. So that distribution of the sizes of the avalanche, that's really the key um, marker of something is kind of in that critical range, meaning that there's not a good sort of typical size to these things. You have many, 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 many tiny avalanches, a few grains of sand, and then every once in a while you have a massive avalanche. Basically, the whole pile goes right. So, I mean, in turns out that sand piles are not modeled well this way, ironically, but other systems are, including
Mm-hmm.
actual like snow avalanches.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why you get, all the time little bits of snow are trickling down the hill. It's no big deal. And every once in a while, something triggers and the whole hillside goes.
Mm-hmm.
And so another distinction that's related to things we've been talking about between how you characterize systems. One are systems with a characteristic scale, meaning that um, they sort of have a general size that they have. They never get much bigger or much smaller than that. Think of a human being's height or weight. You might see someone who's 500 pounds, maybe a little more, but you're never going to see someone who's 1,000 pounds. So you have a characteristic scale of human beings. They exist around 150 pounds. Um, Whereas an avalanche, there's no characteristic scale of an avalanche. It's sometimes it's small, sometimes it's many, many, many orders of magnitude bigger than those small ones. So this is known as a power law distribution. It's kind of probability distribution, and the
Mm-hmm.
self-organized part of that is the fact that when you're, back to the sand pile model, when you're dropping those grains of sand onto the pile, there's no controller who's deciding how those pieces are organized to cause this to happen. It's just by virtue of the way the forces build up in the system. So, one you'll hear about are forest fires. When a fire happens, it burns out the fuel, the deadwood that's around. Um, if you have more and more deadwood build up, so it's a long time between fires, then your fire's bigger. So there's no one organizing that explicitly, say in an uncontrolled environment, but it just happens that way. That a lot of times a little spark or a spark, a lightning bolt hits something. There's a little bit of dead wood around, and it burns up, and it's done. Maybe there's a long, long time between that happens, and the dead wood is so built up that your fire is a massive forest fire, encompassing a whole coast or something. So the self-organized criticality is the fact that without any design, you're getting these um, kinds of dynamics that are sending out every once in a while these events so massive that they just dwarf anything you've seen before. They're just bigger than anything you've seen before. And not only that, but you'll continue to get bigger ones in the future than you've seen before. So even when you think you've seen the most massive thing, no, there's more massive things to come that haven't shown themselves yet. So
Is this a law of some kind? is this something you can bank on?
It's less
And
of
and are there counterpoints too? Like when you clear the forest brush, do you end up with smaller fires in the end, or bigger fires in the
depends
end?
how you. Well, if you clear it, you'll end up with smaller fires. If you
Yeah.
stop the fire and don't let it burn out and keep it there, you get
Uh,
bigger fires.
you
So
get bigger
it's I
fires.
wouldn't think of it so much as a law as a universality class, which is just a big way of saying that there's many kinds of systems that can embody this specific pattern.
Have
So,
you seen that in social systems?
well, I mean, certainly seen it in financial systems.
Right.
You get these small little dips and then huge crashes. Um, so and yeah, you of course see it in social systems otherwise, and there could be some things akin to the forest fire in that as we attempt to quell our passions, to not fight, to not duke it out, that stuff gets bottled up, and how does it come out? I don't know. So eventually in warfare, physical violence, and all of that. So there is something to be said for kind of the Steven Pinker bullshit kind of stuff that everything's getting better all the time and don't worry about it. Look, here's the data. Look at the GDP. Um,
Yeah. Fuck GDP.
all all of that stuff he bases on like, well, there's fewer fist fights, in the bar, and so it's clear things are getting better. But local infighting can actually be something that releases the pressure, so to speak. And people talk about in history, oh, everyone used to be at war all the time. But if you actually look at what those wars looked like before the 20th century, they were actually pretty small scale most of the time.
Yeah.
Little
Yeah.
skirmishes. Some people
Yeah.
died, no doubt. Terrible stuff, but not the kind of stuff, not World War II type stuff.
Right.
Not these huge, massive events that just go on and seem to have no end.
So you do see, and this is sort of where I was going with this, is there are some people, some authors out there and writers that are speculating that the violence is one of these complex systems, and that to the extent that we like stop the fire from burning, we're just actually postponing a later power law event of violence that is just going to happen as a matter of sort of mathematical certainty based on this principle of self-organized criticality.
Well, I think there's one
You know,
author saying that, right?
there's one author saying that, and I was just interested in the way that this applied here because it's just fascinating to see where cause and effect. You think you're helping something out here, but you're actually just backlogging and waiting for something more terrible to happen down the road. And it's just a fascinating concept. And the way you tie this into the masculinity issues and boys being boys, and we don't let them fist fight. There's no more mutual combat. Hell, we don't let our kids play football so much anymore, and we're not teaching kids how to box. And there's no just controlled way to either express your anger in a controlled environment that's non-lethal and whatever, and to also sort of find your place in the hierarchy, right? Like it's good to know where you stand in the hierarchy. I'm oftentimes the dominant person in a group, but I know when I'm not, right? And then when I'm in a room or in a circumstance where I need to be a little bit behind the scenes or step back a little bit, I'm happy to do that, man. Like hierarchy is good for us. And I don't think that our current political environment appreciates hierarchy as a benefit to us in our organization and to our evolution. But that's
Well,
sort of an esoteric
I
conversation.
would actually say that maybe in terms of the rhetoric,
Pushback.
you might be
Do it.
right, but it seems that people are constantly vying for sort of top of the control hierarchy.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah. Because it's smoke and mirrors, right?
right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not that we've somehow evolved beyond that, but I think an important point what you're saying. I'm kind of I get a little bit worried about hierarchical claims because so many things are that we assume are hierarchical turn out not to be. I think in
Okay.
what you're talking about, sort of these dominance structures and whatnot. One of the important points is that they're dynamic.
Right.
It's not some fixed thing. So you walk into this room, this is the kind of structure that emerges. You walk into a room with different people, and it's something different. And your place there depends on who's in that room and the actions that unfold and all the interactions and all of that.
Yeah.
So it's very dynamic. There are hierarchies, but they're they're fluid, they're dynamic, and they're subject to the push and pull of a lot of other forces that are non-hierarchical.
Definitely. And as Jordan Peterson pointed out, and was very careful to point out when he would use the phrase dominance hierarchies, which I think he was beaten into submission to relenting to changing that into competency hierarchies. But what's important to remember about a dominance hierarchy is that it has to be beneficial for everyone in the hierarchy for it to maintain, right? Like the long-term health of that hierarchy depends on people up and down and all around you collectively benefiting from it. It's not like dominance has such a negative connotation to it. It sounds domineering or I'm authoritarian or something, but no, I mean it's leadership and capability and power. But if you don't take care of the people in the hierarchy, then the hierarchy will have no reason to exist. And I think people get confused when they hear the phrase dominance hierarchy and think that it's some terrible nefarious thing. But it's actually, I think, something that we fall into very naturally. You just look at each other's, physical sizes, power outputs, intellectual outputs, powers. I mean, I know where I fit in the hierarchy, and I'm okay with it because I just want to do the thing that I can do the best. And again, if you don't have a 360 perspective and make sure that the hierarchy works for everyone involved, then it just doesn't have any longevity, as far as I can tell.
I guess I like the idea of not necessarily this hierarchy, but calling it dominance hierarchy, because then you have some kind of a slice of reality that maybe it makes sense to think of that way. That guy can beat the shit out of that guy. No question. There you go. That's the order.
Yeah.
But there's, like you said, there's intelligence as a whole. There's infinite dimensions you could slice the situation on, and what is the context, and that's going to affect everything. That's part of the reason I'm kind of hesitant about committing too much to hierarchies, because it seems there's too much going on to kind of reduce it to such a simple structure.
Yeah. But I think about it in terms of evolution, right? You get variety and then selection. And what is a proper evolution, or proving, that something is actually adaptive and functional? It has to somehow stand out, right? It has to somehow appear to be superior, right? So we should be creating systems in which the superior has an ability to surface, right? Isn't that something that we've been talking about through all this, is like making sure that we still have enough variety that then is allowed to flourish so that we can see which one wins and which one loses? There has to be winners and losers, right?
There certainly has to be winners and losers, but there doesn't have to be, sort of back to your point about Helvetica, there's not sort of one static winner for all time and now we're done.
Right. That's exactly right. Exactly right. And it's about, from my perspective with liminal order, about designing for emergence, trying to create a system that will surface the most important salient topics, the things that are most relevant to us, allowing us to focus our signal in on that, so that we are adaptive. I've designed the liminal order with all of these things in mind: fourth generation warfare, which we haven't talked about, but all this decentralization, localism. Even within the group, we have the sort of HQ level workshops and seminars and theme setting, but then we strongly encourage guys to find their ways into squads of like 4 to 8 guys so that they can make personal connections. We encourage them to do that both geographically and by interest. And so even within the group that I've built that has some structure, we're also trying to build the decentralized nature of it, where people can coalesce around whatever it is that they need to coalesce around, but all with the fundamental values as the thing that brought us together in the first place. I saw a tweet from Balaji the other day, that tech guy, and he said that he came up with a way to create a new town. He's like, here's how you create a new town. First, forget about the land. The land is the absolute last thing that you need. The first thing you need to do is establish a set of values, get the customs and the norms established, get the community established, and then you can begin to speculate as to what kind of geography you need. You build a city virtually, you test it all out in VR. Everyone's like, this works for me. Then you find the land, then you build it, and then everybody moves in. You already have the values, you already have the customs, you already have the norms, and the geography is sort of the last bit, which totally turns on its head everything that we've experienced as humans up until this point. Is that right? And do you see any value in that in the future?
It's an interesting idea. I don't think that it's right.
Okay, tell me.
I think that
Tell Balaji.
I think so for things like cultural practices to emerge. This is another process of evolution that a culture forms. The kinds of ways that we exchange information between people does not translate online exactly the same way at all. It's a much
Mhm.
different kind of interaction. You might get along with someone so well, as your best bud online, and then he, becomes your roommate and you fucking hate each other.
Mhm.
So I don't really see that. And I think that, this is back to the Chaz thing. What's one of the things that they missed is like, how are they going to feed themselves? You're autonomous. How are you going to feed yourself? So I think we need, Balaji is a tech guy. I really like him. Um, but I think that tech mindset uh, can cause you to kind of forget about some of the things that actually ground us in the world and actually sustain us. And I don't think it's without its sort of merits to discuss that, because I think there is, and this is what we are kind of discussing earlier. Maybe the solution in part is to move and then stop moving, kind of find your zone and stop moving and stay in place for a while. So that's kind of that kind of feel. But when I was thinking about it, I was thinking more of finding a place that kind of already exists. This is already a town. I'm moving into the town. Trying to form all of that structure without the actual physical interaction of people. To me, I don't think so. One of the things that has been so useful for me is to actually, grow a garden, have some livestock. I I can't imagine kind of even thinking about autonomy without thinking about agriculture first. That's just the
Mhm.
way I'm wired. That's just how I think about it. That's how I see it. You know, Open systems, right? So how are people open systems? How are organisms open systems? We eat food, we drink water, take in sunlight. It's very easy to forget about those things when you kind of take them for granted. But I think moving into the future, we'll be able to take them less and less for granted. I mean, you look at this
Yeah.
coronavirus thing and those Smithfield plants shutting down, and all
Right.
of a sudden there's meat shortages everywhere. That's
Yes.
insanity. That's insanity.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's fascinating element of the way that all of this is being introduced to people bit by bit by bit, even if they're not getting the grand theories, if they're not wisely listening to you or this podcast, but they're experiencing things bit by bit, little pain points, a little notice of choke points, and like, oh man, we are connected. This happened. Who owns Smithfield anyway? Oh,
Right.
China does. Where did the virus come from? And there's just so many, people. But the thing is people are rationally ignorant, right? They're rationally ignorant because most of the time this information is not actionable for them at the moment, and they're rationally ignorant about politics because you do the math. Your vote is very unlikely to be the determining factor in an election. But as it has been in my life, the times at which I felt the most pain were the times at which life was compelling me to act. Right. So eventually we're going to just have a dissonance of feeling inside of us that just gets so great that all these little things add up that you get spurred into taking action. And I wish I'd figured out the solution to just taking action before the pain comes, but pain does seem to be a really big motivator for most people. And that's almost a rational response to everything that's going on. This has been a fantastic discussion for me. I love seeing the way all these different things have a have an echo, have a similar scent, have a similar vibe with the systems and the connectivity and memes and ideas and viruses and actual viruses and safety. Like we've exported safety, imported risk and danger, manufacturing wise, national security wise. And I think that the study of these systems is obviously more important today than ever. And hopefully these ideas will begin to percolate out into the wider conversations. I mean, it's heady stuff. There's no question about that. But it is a way to see the world, and it is a model that has a unifying factors from the universe down to you and your chickens. And if I've learned anything, it's like if you can tune yourselves to the vibe of the universe, right? Like work is good, action is good, right? And evolution is good. If you can tune yourself to those vibes, you're gonna find yourself in a better place. One thing that you said that struck me also is we need to also be aware of the time scale of this stuff. So you you said that your agricultural iterations are annual, and man, that must be tough for somebody. You're a programmer, you said, or you work with data, so you're used to getting pretty quick results. You write some code, you get a result, you see what happens. But man, if you got to take a year to see if that one plan worked out, that requires a whole different vibe, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. But I'll tell you, thing I felt most from that is actually relief. So
Mm,
yeah, things go fast in the digital realm, and things go a lot slower in the physical realm. And there's a kind of rhythm, slow frequency rhythm that I've started to tune into. I'd almost say tune back into, but I can't really say that I ever was tuned into it personally.
mm,
Um, and that is for me one of the important parts about kind of cultivating a place-based life is that there's these rhythms that we're embedded in and play a role in, and this high frequency buzzing of modernity has drowned it all out, and you don't even feel those feelings anymore. You don't know that you're not feeling them.
right.
But I don't know if you've ever read any Wendell Berry.
Nope.
You should. I would recommend The Unsettling of America.
Okay.
He's brilliant, and he talks a lot about local agriculture and place-based living, all those kind of themes. Um, and one of the things that he articulated that I feel more and more all the time is that when you start to live on a spot and try to make your actual living on that spot, the place starts to kind of materially run through you in a way that has a big emotional impact. It's no longer a kind of resource like we were talking about inside and outside of the system, and those start to blur a little in a way where my garden is that inside me or outside me. I'm not even sure
Mm,
anymore.
mm-hmm.
And that the what I'll call contentment that's come along with that has been something that I didn't have before. And I'm looking forward to continuing to do that year after year and get more in tune with it. And the failures are really painful because of that slow iteration. They're like, "Oh my god, I'm really stupid." But, um, that's how you learn. So,
Yeah. Vibing into the low frequency rhythms of life. That's fucking awesome. That's the name of the book coming. Low frequency rhythms.
love it. All right.
How to like rekindle your connection with the slow vibes of the universe. There's no law that says that we are supposed to appreciate the speed and complexity of what happens around us right now, or the way that we're dropped into this, this circuit board of light just flashing on and off all the time. This is new. This is all new for us. We're tuned into the sun, the moon, the tides, the
Yep.
seasons. They all make sense, and I yearn for a simplicity of that, even as the same time as I double down on my connectivity and social media work
I'm the
and
same way, man.
technology
I'm the
work.
same way. I got that
Yeah,
kinda dual life going. I've got this online life. I work remotely,
yeah,
for many things, and then I have this yearning for that simplicity and that place-based living, and I'm just trying to do both because the reality of the economy right now is putting your tendrils out there is beneficial. Um, I think that with this remote work situation kind of coming online, there's going to be more and more people who can do what I'm doing. And my, medium range plan here is to continue to shift towards the local. Like I don't want to always be on the computer, online,
yeah,
whatever programming. I enjoy it. It's good stuff, but it's not something that I want to be my full existence.
yeah. Yeah, well, that's amazing that you were able to identify that for yourself. Amazing that you had courage enough to take action and to take risk and to do it and make it happen for yourself. I'm a little envious that you've already made it out there. I'm looking around. I'm thinking about it myself. Been spending time out in nature a lot. We always have with the kids, and even just in the backyard, you can just see that they just, when their feet get in the dirt and they just start playing with the dirt and that things slow down, there's no devices or YouTube or anything. There's a joy that comes from that you don't get from watching your favorite influencer open some box again for the 50th time. Not that I let them look at that shit either, but you know what I mean. Well, Joe, I am just so honored and thankful that you took time to talk to me about all this stuff. It's been a fantastic conversation. We covered a ton of themes. I hope people get something really good out of this. If you've listened to all the other podcasts, this one fits right in with the themes and right in with the curriculum. It is part of understanding the world in a more holistic way so that you can do what you need to do for yourself. We're doing this in the liminal order. We're addressing all of these themes. We're reacting to all of these issues. We're taking proactive measures. We're starting local with ourselves, improve our families, improve our communities, and hopefully in turn improve our nation. This is our ethos. This is what we're doing. And Joe, thank you so much for contributing to this. Where can people find you online? I'm going to send them to Twitter at Normonics on Twitter. Is there somewhere else where you'd like them to find your work or to engage with you?
I have a little website that I don't update as often as I should, jwnorman.com. But honestly, Twitter, just head there if you want to connect.
Excellent. And a word to the wise, just like with me, don't come stupid to the Twitter feed because you will get blocked.
For the record, I do not mind disagreement at all, but I can't stand lazy like bad take, like fuck you, block.
Right, so, exactly. Yeah. Right. So just come correct and all will be well. Joe and I both have worked hard to build tribes online that engage in critical thinking and are not ideologues in any way whatsoever. So thank you very much, sir. Guys, you can find me again at Jack Murphy Live on Twitter. JackMurphyLive.com is the website. Liminal-order is the other website. Come check us out. If you believe in masculinity, sovereignty, and brotherhood, and if you appreciate where we are in this complex society, come on down and check us out. I think we've got what you're looking for. Joe, thank you so much. Can't wait to do it again. There's 10 more things I had on the list to talk about. We will get to it, sir, but please get back to your chickens, get back to your young children, go learn how to cut a car apart so you can save some guy's life in the volunteer fire department next time up. And thank you very much, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Jack, man. Thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed it too. And I'm really glad that our paths have crossed here. This is good stuff. Thanks, man.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, man. See you later, guys.